So today we're going to have a look at an app called Tardigrain. Tardigrain is a granular synthesizer, been out for the iPad for a couple of years, and we just run it up here. I'm going to run it up. It works as a AU3, but it also works standalone. I'm going to run it up standalone first, and we'll look at the AU3 in a little while. The reason I'm doing this video first and foremost is this is one of those apps, one of the many apps that are let down woefully by the absence of any adequate documentation. There's no manual for this. There are some, if you click on various things and tweak them on screen, you do get tooltips which give you some clue as to the function. And if you look at the bottom left of the screen, there's a question mark. If you press that and then press on one of the controls, you do get some slightly more detailed hints, but they're not enough. They're not adequate to explain the workings of this application, even if you know something about granular synthesis. And so what I'll do is I'll take you around this app and hopefully explain most of what's going on as far as I can understand it. There are a couple of things, or two or three things, that I still haven't been able to figure out, and so I'm just going to have to remain stumped on those. I'll try and point those out as we go. And maybe someone who's watching this will know what these are, and you can comment on the video. So what do we have? Well, we have, let's see now, there's probably three parts to this. Well, it's two parts or three parts to this screen. The bottom half of this screen is the keyboard. You'd be familiar with apps such as this. There's some sort of virtual keyboard built in. I'm not going to say too much about that for now. We'll look at that later, because that's quite a significant thing in its own right. So the top half of the screen's got two parts to it. The first, most obvious part is there's a waveform there. Now, granular synthesis is based on the idea that you have a sound sample, and the synth engine samples tiny little segments of that and plays them repeatedly, and then kind of blends those into a tone. So that's rather than generating the tone using oscillators from scratch. So that's what's going on here. That's the waveform that's loaded. If you look to the bottom left of the screen, there's a folder icon there, which if I just click on different presets, it loads a different waveform each time, but also loads, sets up the other parameters. So that's what the waveform is. You've got two little draggable white stripes here. That's allows you to select a subsection of the waveform to work on. If you drag the sort of white rectangle to the top of the leftmost selector, that moves the entire segment like a little window onto the waveform. It moves it along. If I make that shorter, that's pretty much more obvious. So you can see what that's doing. So the highlighted part there is the only active part of the waveform. What I'm going to do, and I'll explain what all these things do in a moment, those two numbers towards the top center of the screen, if you set those both to ×1, and then just to the right and down there's this thing called shift length. You set that to 0. What should happen is, that's the sort of simplest configuration, if you like. So when you press a key, you get a single grain. In fact, you get two grains, because Tardigrain always plays two grains. That's just to thicken up the sound. So when you press a note, you get those two grains there. The grains are selected from the active portion of the waveform at random. So those two, if I press that repeatedly, you see those two little grey stripes. I'm just going to change this parameter over here. This is you should see what this is. It's an envelope. It's an amp envelope for the tone. So I'm just changing it to have a faster attack, just so we can demonstrate this more clearly. So again, watch those grey stripes. When I just press the note repeatedly, you'll see that they appear in different places each time. So those locations for the grain which is sampled are selected randomly. If you hold, now this I drew attention to the amp envelope to the top left there. There is no filter envelope, so that means if you press and hold a key, the sound just repeats while you hold the key down. Now in this simplest configuration, it's the same grain that's repeated over and over again. There's a couple of things to say about that. Well, there's a lot of things to say about that, but let's just try and do this methodically. Now, typically that kind of setup is too simple, and when you press and hold a key, you want some sort of dynamic selection of the grains. So what can you do there? Well, the first thing to note is that the grain selector, typically you want to have it moving through the sample while you press and hold a key, and that's what these two arrows up here are supposed to achieve. So you can have the grain is going to move left or right. This little control here that I'm manipulating determines how far left or right the grain's going to move on each step, each time it's repeated. If we make it go just left by turning off the rightmost arrow, and we slide that shift length to non-zero, in fact let's slide it to 100%. What that means is that each time the grain repeats, it's going to move 100% of its length in the direction that's indicated. If you've got both directions selected, I think it chooses randomly left or right. So what we should see if we press and hold now is the grain should creep to the left at some indeterminate speed. So let's just try that. So that's what's happening. Now right away that's much more interesting because it's actually sweeping through the waveform or the sound sample, so we're getting something that's much more dynamic, and because we've got two grains sampled at once, that's even more dynamic because we're sampling from two different points on that waveform at the same time. So let's try that again. And if I contrast by that with moving it back to the shift length is 0, so we move that shift length back to, you can make it, I moved it to 100%, let's move it to 50%, we get a different effect. The other thing you can do is that shift length, if you look at the tooltip that comes up, it says shift length and it's a percentage. It's a percentage of the grain length. I'll talk more about how the grain length is determined in a moment. But if you click the little circle in the centre of where those two arrows are, and it becomes a solid circle instead of a hollow one, and then you manipulate that shift length, it's now in seconds, not in percentages, and it goes from 0, well 0 is as it was before, it's static, up to a maximum of 1 second. Now of course the effect of this depends on the specific effect of this depends on the length of the sample. This sample is 3.7 to 30, so about 10 seconds long, so this will move about a tenth of the length of that sample each time it repeats. Is that right? Maybe that is right. If we move it to 0.2 seconds approximately, slower, try even slower, 0.04. But it's moving. I think just for now we'll set that back to relative because that's a little bit easier to control. Okay, so we'll set that length to 100%. So we've got a dynamic movement through the waveform. Now if you direct your attention to this little sort of array of 8 dots up above the shift length, this is just an example of something. These things are not intuitive at all. You would never really figure out, well, it's hard to figure out what that does. But if you put your finger on it and click and drag it, it says play count. Now what that actually is a repeat count. So the sample, if you hold down a key, the sample plays one time and then it shifts, and then it plays in the new position, then it shifts again. If you click repeat count up to 1, it will play the sample and then it will repeat it once before it moves. So in other words, it plays it twice before it moves. So the net effect of that is we should see it going twice or half the speed in terms of the shift. So if you just try and get a feel for how fast that's going, we put the play count back to 0, it's going faster. I'm not convinced about that, but if we put that up to 3, so it should be playing 1 plus 3, that's 4 times each time it plays the grain. So hopefully you can hear that that's actually a different quality of sound, and you should see that the shift is moving slower. I'll just demonstrate that by putting it back to 0. There it is at playing 4 times, and that's it playing 1 time. And if we put that up even higher, we'll put it to 9, which is 1 plus 8. Well, why am I not? So that shift is noticeably slower now. And we've got a much more kind of, well, dare I say, granular sound. And the maximum there is 16, so 1 plus 16. I think that means it plays 17 times. I might got that wrong. So that's what that does. I'm going to put the shift length back to 0 for the moment, because I want to say something about the grain length, how that's determined. Now, I'm not sure what the default grain length is, but it's pretty small. I'm not sure if there's a way to find out what that is. But these two large numbers towards the top centre of the screen, these are multipliers of that grain length. And the one on the left is the minimum multiplier, and the one on the right is maximum multiplier. What this means is each time the grain repeats, the length of the grain is multiplied randomly up to the maximum multiplier. So it will be up to 4 times as long. So it could be anything between 1 times and 4 times as long. So if the grain length is, let's say, half a second, when it repeats, it'll repeat at a length somewhere between half a second and 2 seconds with this setup. If you make both of these the same, so in this instance 4 times, what that means is that the randomness is gone. It will play the sample at 4 times the original grain length. So you should see that you might not see that unless I make that the maximum 64. So you can actually see the thickness of that. The thickness of that grey bar is proportional to the length of the grain, which is intuitively correct given that the time goes from left to right on that visualization of the sample. And again, if I make the left one go back to 1, we should get a random variation between 1 times and 64 times the widths. So you should see those bars. Each time you get a repeat, the size is different within that range. Now you'll notice that when I click and drag these multipliers, they change in powers of 2. If you click that little dotted line above, that allows you to select the multipliers freely. And I guess that in terms mathematically, that's just that's going to give you interesting richness in particularly in the interplay between the two. Let me see. I'm trying to see if I think when it repeats, that grain width is selected at random, but it's applied, it's the same width for both of the instances of the grain. Remember I said that it plays 2 grains at a time. But I think changing the relationship between this minimum and maximum grain multiplier probably gives you different interactions between the successive repeats. And if you do that in powers of 2 versus free format numbers, you probably get some interesting mathematical consequences that are reflected in the quality of the sound. So that's just an interesting thing to play with. There's many ways you can play around with this. One of the ways that I've typically found interesting is to set it to the maximum, so you get long and quite rich sounds. But there's other ways you can play with that, so that's for you to experiment. So we've now got long sounds. We put some of that shift back in. We'll put it back to 100%. In fact, let's make them overlap. We'll put it to close on 50%. Let's make it 100%. Now, one consequence of those longer grains is that the shift slows down because it has to play the grain through before it moves. So again, it affects the quality of the sound in a number of ways. It doesn't sweep as quickly through the sample. It plays a longer, so in some sense, more coherent version or slice of the sample. Of course, it depends on the quality of the original sample as well, whether that makes or what difference that makes. Actually, just a thing I'll point out, this is a natural consequence if you think it through. If you reduce the maximum grain size multiplier, it automatically reduces the minimum one as well, which is logical. But then if you increase it again, the minimum stays where it is, and vice versa. If you increase the minimum, it increases the maximum multiplier as well. So that's just something it's not immediately intuitively obvious till you think it through. So if we make those smaller and then just play that again. Let's change the grain direction to be both ways, and that should randomly select the direction to move each time. I'll just point something else out here as well. When you look at, there's a lot of videos for tardigrade on YouTube, and when you look at them, you get the feeling that tardigrade has a particular characteristic sound, and one of the characteristics is that sort of snapping, popping sound, which is not going to happen. That sort of thing. Incidentally, I'm playing chords there, which I didn't mention that earlier, but if you play 2 notes at once, you obviously get 2 grains, or 4 grains in fact, because we play 2 at a time. So it's an even richer sound. Anyway, back to what I was saying, that popping and snapping, it's not a characteristic of the kind of manipulations that tardigrade does. It's actually a consequence of the particular sample. This particular sample has got those pops or snaps built in. Now there's no obvious way to play the raw sample through, but if I just give you a quick heads up, if you look at this, if I'll press the question mark and I'll click on these blobs over here, this says that this little section is about recording your own samples. What it doesn't say is what each of these little icons does. And the one that's the circle, if I press that, you might expect that to be, and in fact that is the record button, but it seems to have an extra use, which is if you just press it, it'll play the sample, the raw sample through. So you can hear those snapping, popping things are built into the sample. If I select another preset, if I play that sample through, that preset's called Game Boy Chord, so there's no prizes for guessing what that sample is of. And I'll just do one last one. Phase 2, I don't know what this is. Play that sample. So that's not intuitive at all, but it's how you get to hear what the underlying sample is. So let me see, let's go back to the original. I'll just quickly look at the amp envelope. I mean, this really doesn't require much explanation, but the envelope at the top left of the screen, you can change the various phases just by dragging these blobs. So if I change the attack to 0, if I change the release to 0, and then the sustain and decay, that doesn't seem to do what I expect it to do. I'm not sure that decay and sustain are working in a way that matches my intuition. I would have thought if you put the sustain to 0, the tone should disappear. I suspect, okay, let me try, if we make the grains as long as they can go, this might make it more obvious actually. Yeah, that's more like it. So that amp envelope is applied to the individual grains, not to the overall tone. So if you've got very short grains, you're not even going to notice that. If you've got long grains, which we do now, let's have long grain and a short decay. Oh, good grief, that's very unresponsive. Short decay and a very low sustain. So that's interesting. We're getting a kind of a pulsing sound. Anyway, that's the amp envelope for individual grains. You can play with that. Over to the top left, we've got a thing called gain. Now that sort of seems to be the volume. But then there's a thing next to it called gain balance. Oh, maybe that's the balance between the two independent grains. Well, that's one of those things that I'm just not sure what that does. So we have to leave that as a mystery for now. There's one thing we haven't looked at in the middle of the screen, underneath those two large numbers for the grain width multiplier. There's a thing that looks like a musical note, and if I hold a key and then drag that, that has, I mean, you can use that as an effect while you're playing, you know, if you want to sort of bend a note. Does that bend? It does bend it with a nice sort of glide on it. But that's not its purpose. Its purpose really is when you import your own sounds. If you import a sound, in fact, let's look at how you do that now. This round circle, if you look back at these icons towards the middle of the screen, incidentally, there's these 4 icons over to the left in the centre of the screen. These are actually not to do with tardigrade. These are put in there by AUM. Don't worry about those. So the round record button is actually for recording your own sample. If I play that, my best understanding of this is it's got a dual function. It's an overloaded button. When the sample is when there is a sample loaded, if you press that, it plays the sample through. If there isn't a sample loaded, because if you press the dustbin icon, it deletes it, and then you press that, and then you talk, it's going to record what you're saying. So that's a recording of my voice. If we make a long grain there and 0 shift. So you can see that that's using the sample of my voice that I've just recorded. Might as well leave that loaded as a nice experiment. Incidentally, one of the other things, in fact, let's just go left to right on these icons. The monitoring, that's interesting. The one that looks like a little microphone is for monitoring the input. So we're getting a bit of an echo there, given that we're already recording the sound. So I'm obviously getting a delay. That's quite a nice effect. I like that. It's like a reverb. And then we've got the overloaded play or record button. The button next to it is a complete mystery. If I record a sample again by deleting what's there, if I click the record button and talk, you can see that little center icon is now illuminated. And if you click on it, it says select record loop point. And then press it again. I haven't figured out what's going on there. What might be going on is if you're recording and you press set loop point, it starts looping the recording that it's accumulated so far and also continues recording with that loop playing over the top. That's quite a sophisticated, that's like an overdub facility. Maybe that's what it's doing. Let me try that again. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I think that is what it is. That's like an overdub feature. So there you go. I've discovered that in Vivo, if you like. What else? There's 2 more things there for manipulating samples. One of them is, well, the rightmost one is audio paste from the clipboard. If I go over to, where can I go? Audio share and find a sample. These are some samples I've just downloaded, some free Minimoog samples. Just choose one. Well, might as well choose that one. If I go audio copy, and then we go back to, where are we? Tardigrade, and I go audio paste, it allows me to paste that in. There it is. So that's useful. That's a very simple way to import your own samples. In fact, I'll just quickly slip over to AUM. I'm going to load an AU version of Tardigrade to demonstrate something else. So this is the AU version. We full screen it, it looks pretty much the same. It's not quite the same because where we have those icons for manipulating your own samples, those are no longer there. They're replaced by a single icon, which looks like a battery. I don't know why it looks like a battery. If you click it, it says no audio found. If we come out of that, go into the standalone version of tardigrade once more. If we click this remaining icon, the one that looks like two sheets of paper overlapped, it says audio copied. We go back to AUM into the AU version. Now if we click that thing that looks like a battery, it pastes in the sample. That's the only way, as far as I know, to get a sample into the AU3 version of tardigrade, and I believe that's something to do with the way AU3s are implemented. So back to the standalone version. So what else? There's not a lot more to say about the basics of this. We've got a square thing here. This is a reverb. So if I click and, in fact, rather than click and hold, there's a button down to the right here on the keyboard which says hold on. It's like an infinity sign. If you just click now, it will keep that sound playing. If we change this size of this square just by clicking on it, dragging it left and right, that's not a very good example actually. Let me that shows the reverb slightly better. If we change the room size, it's hard to, once the square's small enough, it's hard to drag it without dragging that ball. And I think the ball is like a wet and dry mix of the reverb. That's some version of that anyway, so you get the idea. That's fairly conventional. Let's choose something else. Oh yes, tuning. I was just demonstrating what that tuning thing was for. So if you load in a sample, or you record a sample, let's imagine you record your own voice humming or something. Let me try that. So there we go, there's my hum. Now the problem is, if you wanted to use that in a musical context, playing tunes along with other things with real notes, it arbitrarily assigns that to a C0, so that's octave 0 C, or C0 might be middle C in this context, I don't know. And so whenever you play a C on the keyboard, that's on the virtual keyboard or on the, I've got my own MIDI keyboard connected up as well. Whenever you play a C, you'll get that tone. Now, if that's not actually a C, it won't sound right played with other apps or musical instruments. So the idea is you can change the tone of that is anchored to by just sweeping this compensation. That's a misspelt. Compensation. So that's roughly what the pitch compensation is for. What else do we have at the top here? We've got a couple of other things. If we go back to our original sample, go back to 0 shift minimum pitch size, minimum grain size. You direct your attention to that waveform at the top right of the screen. That's a thing called pitch spread. And that, you probably figure out what that does. It basically detunes those two grains that it plays in parallel, so you get a detuned effect. So that's a nice kind of chorusy effect, and you can go mad with it. that's pretty cool. What else do we have? Those two little round blobs are stereo spread. So that basically seems to move the two grains out in the stereo field apart or together. Just above that we've got a bit crusher, which basically degrades the sample that's playing. It's not. So that can be done subtly or unsubtly. Again, depending very much on the sample you're playing and all the settings of the other parameters, you get very different effects. And I think the last two things up here that I haven't mentioned are these. These again are two things which are, I can't really be very explicit about what they do because I don't understand them. But if you move these little sliders up and down, we've got a wave shaper gain and wave shaper output gain. Now I don't know what that means. I'm not really sure what it means by wave shaper. It gives, but if you play with them, you get some sort of distortion or overdrive. So just another thing to play with. So I think we've covered everything in the basic features of tardigrade. What we haven't covered is the entire operation of the keyboard, including, well, intersecting with the way that you can modulate all these parameters. Now you can modulate these parameters from the keyboard, which we'll look at in a little while, and also you can modulate them from an external source. Which can be very useful. You can be very creative, so we'll have a look at that as well. Now this is not a great keyboard in terms of, you know, being able to perform on it. It's not very, the colours contrast's very low and it's kind of narrow. But anyway, you can click on it. You've got an octave up, an octave down. You can. The other thing you can do is you can, now then, if you look at this keyboard, it may not work quite as intuitively as you expect. If I play this left to right, let me just change the attack and release. It's actually playing a minor scale. If I click on one of these other buttons, by the way, it's not immediately obvious what these things are, but you'll notice that when I click on one of them, it changes the layout of the keyboard. In fact, what you're doing, you've got 6 different keyboard scales, if you like, to select there. And when you click on one, it plays the root note of that scale. So it's the first note on the scale, although it says minus, so that's an A, I'm presuming. On that pad it actually says minus 3A, so I'm presuming the root that it plays there is 3 octaves below that one. If you click this one, it'll play a B. This one will play a G. This will play an F sharp, E, D. But you'll see, I mean, when you first look at this, you might be tempted to think these are chords, that clicking one of these pads would play like a B minor chord. But it doesn't, it just plays a B. So what are these? Well, if you look across to the right hand side of this keyboard, there's a little pencil icon. If you click that, It rather confusingly says edit chord mode on, which just again confuses you into thinking that these are chords. They're not actually chords, as I say. These are setting up the keyboard. The one that's highlighted says B minor. Now if you look at these little dots around there, you've got 5 different options for your keyboard, for each keyboard setup. You can have the major scale, the minor scale, and the keyboard can be set up to I don't know what you call it. It's the scale. If it's on the major, if you've got major selected, it will play the notes on the major scale. If you have minor selected, it will play the notes on the minor scale. You have 3 other options. The rightmost plays the scale. The middle dot plays a 7th chord. I'm out of my depth here, I'm not very musical. I think it's the notes of a 7th chord. Now that suggests to me that if you have that set up, then you can play any combination of notes and you'll get something that sounds like a 7th chord. And the other option is triad. So what will it do there? So basically it's only got 3 notes from presumably the minor scale or the major scale. So that's a major chord basically, or a minor chord. So that's pretty good. It means even if you're a musical idiot, somewhat like I am, you can play minor chords to your heart's content just by selecting that pad. And then again, you can set up all these pads differently, and of course the point of that is you can be playing. In fact, if I set this up with hold, and then if I just switch between the pads, let's try that again with something that sounds slightly more musical. Then just switch between the pads. That sounds rubbish. Let me try that with something else. So you can see what's happening there is if you hold down some notes and switch between the scales that you've selected, it actually changes which notes are being played. So that's, creative possibilities abound there. Oh, the other thing that I just forgot to mention, when you go into edit chord mode, so called, you can change the number of keys displayed on the screen to be larger or smaller. Maximum 12, wouldn't make any sense for smaller than that, but you can have them fatter. Now, the reason that's a good idea will become clear when we look at modulation. In fact, we'll probably do that now. If you notice when I press on one of these keys and move my finger up and down, well, the first thing to notice, when you press on the key, you get a little crosshair appears underneath your finger. And that's kind of like an XY pad. And you'll see that if I move my finger up and down, things are happening. At least two things are happening that I can see. First thing is that ball in the centre of the reverb window is moving up and down. Is it moving up and down? And the second thing that's happening is, well, the second and third thing, because the two ends of that selected subset of the waveform are moving, and also they're moving at different rates, which is interesting as I move up and down. I think that's all that's happening. Now that's because you can set up your finger swipe up and down and left and right to modulate any of these parameters. And again, accessing this, you pretty much wouldn't stumble across this if you didn't know about it. The way you get to this, over to the right of that waveform, there's a very faint vertical bar. If you click and hold on that for about half a second and let it go, it pops out this modulation strip, I suppose you'd call it, and you can see the things that are available to be modulated are to do with a filter. Now we don't have any other access to a filter on the screen, so this is new. So you can have a low pass filter, a band pass or a high pass. If we go with low pass, and then the little horizontal bar above the word filter, if you click on that and you keep clicking on it, it will cycle through a number of different icons, and you get a rather annoying tooltip because it comes up right over the top of the. So what can we do? We look through the options. We've got off, then we've got, so this is the high pass filter, low pass filter, sorry. That can be modulated by an up and down absolute swipe. So the cutoff frequency is lower towards the bottom, higher towards the top. And it's absolute, so wherever you poke that's the cutoff you get. If I change that to relative, you can do the same thing in the X direction, which is left and right, which is less useful because you've got a very limited range of movement. If we go for Y relative, then it doesn't matter where you put your finger. I think it starts in the middle. And then X relative. Then you've got a bunch of things which I don't think we've got access. I think from reading something somewhere, these last few options are to do with MPE modulation. Pitch bend. I wonder if maybe it understands pitch bend from my. No, it doesn't. Pressure. Okay. It understands after pressure there, so after touch. Wondering why I didn't do pitch bend. Well, anyway, so that's how you modulate things. So it looks like you've got a subset of the parameters available for modulation, but actually they're all there. These three in the middle, these four, in fact, apart from the filter, all of these titles are swipeable, and so you have access to modulate all of the parameters. Okay, I hope that made sense. So looking at the ones that are actually that have something selected, we've got the minimum multiplier is now selected on the X modulation, as is the grain start, which is that leftmost bar of the sample. The room size is selected on the up and down swipe, and so on. So that's how you do modulation from the inbuilt keyboard. That modulation, incidentally, I think works on these little root note pads as well. I think the last thing we look at is how to do that modulation externally. If I go back into AUM and we look at actually I'll just show you one more thing, because we're about to look at the AU3 version. Let's imagine I've just created this patch and I want to save it. There is a save. You click the floppy disk icon and I'll put MH2 and save, and that appears under these presets down the bottom, MH2. If I now close that guy and I go into the AU3 version and I look in the presets, we don't have MH2, it's not available. Let me see if I close that. In fact, if I get rid of that and then reload a new instance of that and go over, going to, yeah, see, we don't have MH2. We don't seem to be able to swap presets between the AU version and the standalone version. That one there is something I created this morning. So that's a bit of a rough edge, I think. I'm not sure if that's a rough edge or not. It may be something about the technology of how this stuff is created, because you remember when I showed you earlier that you can't import a wave sample into the AU3 version. Given that the wave sample is an intrinsic part of a saved preset, it maybe that was a conscious decision on the part of the developer not to allow that. Otherwise, if you loaded a preset, it would load it without the wave. It would load perhaps the setup of the parameters and the modulation, and maybe that just doesn't make sense. So the last thing we're going to do is, we're in the AU3 version of Tardigrade. Everything's pretty much the same, with the exceptions that I've mentioned already. But I want to look at how to modulate those parameters externally. If you look down at the left-hand side of the Tardigrade screen near the bottom, the only icon we haven't clicked on yet is the one that's the MIDI connector, and that allows us to select MIDI channel. MIDI CC is on. I think that's off by default. I've clicked that on. I'm not sure about that. Bluetooth connections, that's not applicable for now. And the parameter, now these things, you can't click on these things. These are just showing this is just a crib sheet of the modulatable parameters and the CC number that you need. So if we look at one, let's just choose the one. Let's see now. If we choose an obvious one, so the pitch spread, which would be CC number 17, we look at two ways to do this. We look at a software way. So if we load in a Rosetta XY, I'll probably miss a step here. So this gives us XY pads, and I think we're going to have to go onto the Tardigrade and select Rosetta as an input, the MIDI input. Rosetta is transmitted on MIDI channel 1, and 17 was the one we wanted. And 14, what's that? Well, we're up. Okay, so on the x-axis we're modulating the room size accidentally. Can we change that to not modulating anything? No. And on the y-axis we've got parameter 17, which is pitch spread. So if I modulate that with the y-axis of that XY pad, I'm still playing the standalone version of Tardigrade, which is I removed from AUM, but it's still open behind the scenes. So right, back to the plot. Let's go with this guy. Pitch spread. So we're modulating that on the y-axis of that XY pad. And just for fun, on the x-axis we'll put the sample start, which would be what parameter? What is it called? Grain start, parameter 20. So we put that on 20. So you can see that moving. Now, interestingly enough, we're slightly more constrained in terms of modulation, flexibility, doing it externally. Well, I say that, it depends on the app that you're using to do the modulation. This Rosetta XY pad, it can only modulate one parameter on each axis. Now, other applications may be able to modulate multiple parameters at the same time. In fact, if I kill that and go back into Tardigrade itself and look back at the modulation of the with the keyboard, let me just see what we're doing here. Yeah. So if I want to modulate the, let me see, grain start and the grain stop, both on the, that's annoying, maybe you only get the tooltips in the standalone version. That's interesting. See, you discover things as you go. Well, anyway, the grain start, we'll put it on that vertical. Bar, and the grain stop also. Oh, that's interesting, it's not working. Grain stop. Well, anyway, the other thing I was going to show you was you can actually change the spread. So by dragging the top and bottoms of those little blue stripes, we can limit the range through which that parameter varies of when we manipulate that slider through its whole range. So you see that we're going through the full range of the slider vertically, but that grain start is only varying through part of a portion of the sample. But we're not sure why the grain stop isn't animating. I wonder if we have to... Oh geez, it's going upside down. Yeah, so there we have them now. We've got grain start and grain stop, both varying with that finger swipe through a small range of their full potential movement and at different rates. So that's something we couldn't do with the Rosetta XY modulation. But there's another way we can do that if we look at how to modulate this from a piece of hardware, let's say using AUM as the driver. So if we go into AUM MIDI control, if we connect a MIDI source, which is going to be my Korg Nano controller, and then if I go back and underneath Tardigrade AU extension, if I click that and click parameters, we get a list of all the parameters. It publishes these so we can hook into them. This is very easy to use, and we can MIDI learn these. So if we again choose the, let's say we'll put this onto sliders. So we'll have a slider for the pitch spread. So if we click on pitch spread and learn, and then just move the slider, we've got one, that's the leftmost slider on there. We'll have a slider for the grain start. Oops, learn. And then we'll have a slider for the grain stop. We can't use the same slider in this case, That's okay. So that's done. So now if I move my pitch gain slider, if you look over there, in fact I'll let this go. Here's the pitch gain. Hang on a minute. I'll do the pitch gain in a minute. Let's move the other two sliders. That's the left grain start and the grain stop. And if I can move those together, two sliders at once. Now if I move my pitch spread, okay, so that's that. That's pretty much all we've got to see. I think the last thing I'll do is just show you. So we've been running this from the virtual keyboard. You can play it from your MIDI keyboard. Of course, the other way of playing this is to drive it from a MIDI source. We can do that again. Let's do it two ways. We take out that Rosetta and we put in a different Rosetta. We could use particles. And then we have to, what do we do? On Tardigrade we need to put that as a MIDI source. So that's one way of doing it. If we take that out, we could put in, let's see, interrupt. Let's try quantum. Let's try that. Again, we have to select quantum as a source. And then we have to start it going. I've set up quantum here just to so I'm just playing random notes there in a sequence. But I think that's all we'll look at today. My battery on my camera is about to run out, so that's Tardigrade. To the best of my knowledge, that's all the functions. If anyone's got any helpful comments about things I've missed or things I've misunderstood, that'd be really good to know. Maybe we'll do some more creative things with Tardigrade later. I'm just getting to know this. I've only had this a few days myself. So, yep, there you go.